For our COBT listeners and viewers, it's Maynard, Mike, and Jeff here with something super, just really spectacular. We have made a new friend. Her name is Julia Weller, and she's the principal with Energy Law International. She's made a career in helping a lot of parts of the world reform their energy laws. And so she's been doing it in the context of introducing market reforms, introducing other policy reforms that stimulate energy growth. As I say, she's made an entire career of it. We bumped into her because we were reading her paper recently about Israel and some of the changes that have been happening in the Israeli power markets, which was really intriguing. Julia, it's been a delight to get to know you, and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about energy law around the planet.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here.
Well,
I'm interested in knowing that you read my paper about Israel, because what's happening in Israel is very interesting. Despite the rocket attacks and despite the constant barrage of missiles, Israel has gone forward with the reform in their electricity sector. As of July 25th, just a couple of weeks ago, they opened the retail electricity market to allow consumers who do not have a smart meter to buy electricity from the provider or the producer of their choice. And the energy minister is hoping that this will see prices and costs for energy consumers reduced between 5 and 20%. So it's an amazing development given what's going on in Israel right now.
Well, it really is. We've all read the paper. You can see it's like grad school here. I've got it, lots of highlights. Julia, we're ready. Mike, we never talk about power. So no, in all seriousness, as we lean in and start talking to Julia about the rest of the world, what's going on in the markets today? What would you tell us? I know it's greener, and that's good.
What's going on in markets today? That's a really interesting question. What I'd say is, over the last 3 or 4 weeks, you probably heard us talking about rotation. Rotation, out of the S&P 500 into the Russell 2000 stocks. We saw that over the last 3 or 4 weeks. The AI stocks had come down, S&P had come down, and that really changed over the last week. On Monday, I think that changed from rotation to volatility, right? The volatility is just off the charts. You had to basically Dow down like 1,300 points at the bottom on Monday, and today Dow's up about 500. The Nikkei average was down about 13%, the biggest drop since 1987, and it's up 10% today. You had Bitcoin, which was supposed to be a hedge to all this, was down 10%. Now it's up 5% today. So definitely a lot of volatility in markets right now. So it's not, it's a difficult market, and so you just be aware of that. I think the thing we'd say is just from a volatility standpoint, to just tell you how crazy it's been. Volatility in the S&P is usually in the 10 to 20 price range. It's been there for the last year. On Monday, it got up to almost $65. Now it's, yesterday it closed around 35 and today it's down 25. That's still on the top end of the range, but the volatility is off the charts. And, some crazy people, Jeff will talk about it a little bit, is that, people are just panicking, right? Some people are saying that the Fed needs to get out there right now, cut rates right now, emergency rate cut. If the Fed were to do that today, markets would plunge tomorrow, because that would just say, hey, we're behind the curve, we're worried as well. That is directly the wrong signal at this point in time to be sending. Are U.S. markets slowing down? Is the global economy slowing down? We've been talking about that in crude prices. Crude price today is around $73, $74 a barrel. And we've been saying this. Demand is the issue that's overhanging crude oil right now. And that's going to continue to be the case. What's interesting is we have our guests on today. And, one thing I'd say is going on with crude oil. The reason crude oil came down from a technical standpoint and went through its 50, 100, and 200-day moving averages, but now it's going on in demand issues. And so I think people were net long contracts. Now they've got net neutral crude oil contracts, and they're looking to go net short contracts. But they're looking to see what plays out here with the Iranian response to Israel over the next 24, 48 hours. If nothing of serious consequence comes from that, I do think that you're going to probably see some traders start to lean into that from a short standpoint, so we could see a little bit more volatility to the downside. So that's kind of what's going on with crude oil markets, global equity markets. As it relates to energy equities, we're really kind of spreading out. We're seeing a lot of E&Ps reporting, refiners, midstream, stuff of that nature. And I think efficiency, everything seems to be going well. Return of capital is still a big buzzword. So things are looking great there. So yeah, look, we're going to have volatility. There was a risk-on trade over the last, a risk-off trade over the last day or two. Risk-on trade today. Markets are all over the place. So I think the key, if you're sitting there with some cash in your pocket, this is a market to be opportunistic. We wouldn't be piling in today, but this is a market where energy companies, this is why you have your balance sheets in pristine shape, is because you can opportunistically step in, and we'd be doing that.
And how much longer do we have in earnings season, Mike?
We're probably another 7 to 10 days, and we get through the bulk of it.
I felt sorry for the companies that had to report in the midst of the storm. That was rough. Jeff, what would you throw in?
Only probably two things. I think the frustrating part for energy companies is, the return profiles continue to be, reasonably good given the commodity backdrop. But, for most of the names in the traditional energy space, they underperformed on the way up this year. So we're underperforming the broad market and have underperformed, in this turmoil. So all they can really do is focus on generating cash flow, generating returns. And, this last little sell-off is definitely, evidence that there's still a lot of clawing back that is going to have to credibility, and there's kind of this jaded view of energy stocks. It just frankly has been reinforced here over the last 10 days. Market sells off, energy sells off harder. And the second thing is really just yesterday was interesting to me because we try to be balanced, listen to all sides, stay level headed, and that's normally with regards to energy. And then you hear. You couldn't help with the TV on yesterday hearing everyone talk about '08, and this is, I don't know if people lived through '08 are talking about that. We're sitting here with the S&P 500 up double digits year to date. Yeah, market's been soft, but it's just that lack of perspective and lack of balance just creeps to all walks of life apparently.
Yeah, we're just a little too on edge with respect to so many things. Well, Julia, the market backdrop is certainly volatile, as you've heard. As I mentioned, we stumbled across your Israel work, and then have gotten to know you, and it's really quite interesting, all the work that you've been doing at Energy Law. There's a lot of countries have been changing their laws as it relates to energy to try to encourage better supply, better prices, better results. I think that'd be a fascinating place to start, is just a little bit of your work at Energy Law and the countries you've seen and helped. I think just some perspective there would be great.
Well, I started this area of law 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And USAID had decided to focus on the countries that had formerly been part of the Soviet Union, with the perspective of trying to get them away, wean them off Russia, wean them off the Soviet Union, which is now, Commonwealth of Independent States, and bring them into the political sphere of the US and the Europeans. And so what they did was try to help all those countries, because those countries had all been attached somehow to the Russian energy system. And when Russia was falling apart, it could no longer supply the energy at a cost rate prices and invest in the in all those former Soviet Union states. And so the US decided that they would try to encourage investment from the West, from the Europeans and from the Americans, to try and help those countries come towards the European Union. And that's what we were hired then as a firm, a law firm, when I was with Pierce Atwood, which was a Portland, Maine-based firm, to work on that energy sector reforms. And that's what we did. We helped them change, because their laws were so poor. They didn't actually even have companies that had been corporatized. I mean, everything was still owned by the ministries. And so that first step was to corporatize the energy sector and then create the laws that would attract investment. And because they were all falling apart, they were patched up with glue and sellotape. They didn't have anywhere. They hadn't done any repairs for a long time. So that was the start of my career in energy reforms.
Can I ask you just something on that, Julia? This came up in another conversation today with a sort of a geopolitical scholar, which is the question was, and you saw that era when the Soviet Union fell and the West tried to get involved and help the healing process, I guess. The question is, did the U.S. do enough, or the West, did they do enough? Did they provide enough aid, including to Russia? Like, as you reflect on that period, do you have any takeaways on what we could have done better, in particular as it relates to Russia, so that they would be more of a part of the global community?
Yes, I agree with that, because I think what happened was the US and Europeans were so focused on bringing those satellite countries away from Russia and basically pushing Russia away. And I think that was a mistake, because Russia was also, had crumbling. All their energy facilities were crumbling. They needed help too. But I think we were so focused on trying to wean former Soviet satellite countries away from Russia that we kind of missed the boat there on Russia. And I think that looking back, I think we should have made more effort to also get Russia involved in getting its laws updated and getting investment so that the investment would not come from Iran. They would not be buying oil from Russia. So we wouldn't have alienated Russia the way we did.
And as you reflect on my impression of your work is, so it started, as you say, helping Eastern Europe pull away from the Soviet Union, but then it began to morph as more countries, it seemed like, were calling you and asking you for guidance and wanting some market reforms. Maybe talk about how it went from Eastern Europe and spread.
Yeah, it spread from Eastern Europe to South Asia. Countries in South Asia who actually were probably part of the Soviet Union earlier on. And so that work has morphed into helping countries to improve their legal systems to make investments safer, so that they would be able to, the companies that were investing in these countries could get their returns out, because the big problems with having laws that were not geared towards capitalism and introducing capitalist concepts. That was one of the big issues in the beginning. But now, obviously, all those countries, most of the countries that I started working with in the beginning were now part of the European Union, and then the other countries that I still work with are part of something called the Energy Community, which is sort of a waiting room for countries that want to get into the European Union. And so they are in the process of adopting all of the EU laws with regard to energy and environment. And they're wannabes, want to be part of the European Union. And they're hopefully going to be admitted in the next few years.
Do you find it interesting, Julia? It seems like you across this expanse of your career, you saw this period where we were moving from, state control or sort of planned economies to free market economies, and there was a period where, communism is dead, socialism is dead, and then we were moving hard towards market reforms, and then we've kind of entered a new phase where the climate concerns and environmental concerns have started to become a large focus of Western law. Like, what would you say about how the focus of your practice has been changing through the years?
Yes, as climate concerns have increased, and the pushes from the Paris Accords, the push has been towards reducing carbon emissions and worrying about climate change. lot of these countries now have signed on to the Paris Accords and are in the process of introducing more renewable energy and trying to reduce their carbon footprint. So that's now a very significant area of the law now in those countries.
In your work, I assume the entities we have found really interesting in their effect on energy policy around here include the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IMF, like these types of organizations, these global organizations. You must have had a lot of dealings with them. They must affect a lot of energy policy, particularly in the developing world. But are there some perspectives you could share there?
You're absolutely right. In emerging markets now, that depend so much on these big banks, to the investment banks to help finance a lot of the new construction, and especially with regard to interconnections now, because the big push is to have countries become interconnected so that they don't have to have their own production to rely on. They can rely on other countries who have perhaps excess power, or excess generation that they can use. So a lot of the investment banks, the international investment banks, are wanting to limit somewhat their investment, because most of these cross-border facilities are either for natural gas or for electricity, and the electricity is, they can't rely too much on renewable energy because it's intermittency, and they have to have backup power. But these countries are moving towards adopting all of the regulations that the EU has promulgated, and the investment banks are actually picking up on all that and making sure that they're sometimes refusing to invest in the energy sector of Israel and Cyprus and Greece, where Israel is trying to be able to export their excess gas, because they have so much gas discoveries now in the Mediterranean. They were actually the promoter of what's called, it used to be Euro Asian Energy, and it's now morphed into a different name. But they were the Energy Investment Bank rejected an application to have investment from them in the new gas interconnectors between Cyprus and Israel and Greece, because of concerns about the carbon footprint.
So this is and this is something that you talk about in your paper.
Yeah.
Well, you talk about, there's so much in here, Julia, but just to wade in a little bit, you talk about the Great Sea Interconnector, and that is to connect, from an electricity standpoint, Israel, Cyprus, and Greece. But then you were just also making reference to Israel has a lot of gas, and they would like to build a gas pipeline on a similar route. And I think if I'm following you correctly, it's easier to get the capital for the connector on the renewables energy than it is to get the capital to build the gas pipeline. Is that fair?
That's correct. I think that they have got interest from Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates are willing to make investment now in the gas interconnector, the Great Sea Interconnector, and they hopefully that will go forward at some point, because Israel has a lot of excess gas and Cyprus has gas, and this will be able to transport this gas to Europe, and so that they would have more gas available, that they wouldn't have to depend on Russia.
Well, and this is an interesting point, Julia. So these are my words, not yours. But when you conform your laws so that you can get admitted into the EU, and you sign the Paris Accords, and you do all that, you meet the requirements, that's a really positive thing from being able to draw capital and, the rule of law and all that kind of thing. But it's kind of a negative too, because you've now signed up for what the EU says is, quote, good and bad in energy, and so it's good for your energy overall, but it's maybe not good for instance, like this natural gas pipeline example. Is that a fair way to characterize it? Like there's a little bit of good and bad when you join the club?
You're right. I think that is the positives, I think, are that you have access to capital from the European Union, and the European Union actually has committed over 600 million euros to the Great Sea Interconnector, as well as wanting to help them find other capital to get that project off the ground. Some of it is already off the ground. They've already built some of the interconnection between Crete and Cyprus, about 30 or 40 kilometers, I think. They're starting off. But you're right that it is a two-edged sword, because on the one hand, they want to become part of the European Union because of the access to capital and monies and all these different funds that are available. But on the other hand, if they commit to all the restrictions that the gifts come with, then that actually provides some limitations on what they can do.
These things that, and again, I'm referring to your paper, but you do make reference to the Great Sea Interconnector, which is the Israel, Cyprus, Greece, but you sort of broadly refer to the focus right now, which is to try to get energy from Middle East, North Africa into Europe. And there's a number of projects going on where there's pipelines or interconnectors or cables trying to get power across the Mediterranean. That's fascinating technologically and politically. Those are pretty amazing projects.
A lot of them, unfortunately, didn't come to fruition. There was so many projects on the drawing board that they these solar idea of having solar energy coming from countries in the Middle East and bringing those to Europe. But the instability, I know we have instability in our markets now today, as we've just discussed, but the instability in the North Africa region really put the kibosh on a lot of those projects. And so now they're less and less, they have a smaller component now that are trying to get the power to Europe. But I think that, as I described in my paper, a lot of the most biggest projects have been, had to be canceled because of the instability in the Middle East.
I think probably the thing, Julia, reading your paper, and it's very well written and someone can jump in and educate themselves pretty quickly. But I was just struck by, you talk about in 1985, basically Israel was a I guess you might say a socialist country.
Absolutely.
It was very, like the government, really owned most things, most key parts of the economy. And from 85 on, the country has been going through a privatization and a liberalization of the economy. And of course, Israel watchers know it's got a huge tech sector. It's had a very successful run, and so energy is just one piece of that. But would you talk about just this, 40-year kind of run that Israel's been on towards more liberalization and privatization?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that is due to current prime minister, when he was at different times, he was in charge of economics, he was in charge of all different areas. And I think Netanyahu has been instrumental in making those changes. And I think he was also instrumental in the reforms that I discussed in that paper in the energy sector, liberalizing the energy sector, selling off power plants moving. I think the current energy minister, Eli Cohen, is very keen to move Israel off coal because many of its old power plants are still run on coal. They still import coal from Colombia, although Colombia now just decided that they were going to embargo coal. But they also get coal from Australia, from South Africa. But they're trying to move away from coal and have more renewable energy. So the whole energy system in Israel is changing dramatically. They've already reduced much of their coal dependence, and they've shut down some of their old coal plants. But the two biggest coal plants are in the process of being converted to natural gas because they have all this natural gas. They have way more than they can use in Israel. So a lot of it's being exported to Egypt. And as I said, they're hoping to export it to Europe. But there has been dramatic change from, unlike in the US, which seems to be heading in the opposite direction. But Israel really did make a big change and a cut from its socialist roots. The kibbutzim were all socialist and much more left-wing than the majority of the Israelis. But the socialist roots were very long and very deep, but they were gradually being changed, and Israel has definitely made its footprint in the capitalist systems.
Yeah, Julia, you mentioned you struck a chord with me about the gas exports to Egypt, and obviously Noble Energy was there for many years. Chevron bought them, and what really impressed me about not the deal per se, but just the exports to Egypt, it seemed to me that the more you do business with people, the more opportunity you have to basically establish relationships, and so that'd be point number one. I guess the question I would have for you is, just this last week we watched this PJM, electricity auctions occur, and you had prices in that capacity auction were like $275, $280 a megawatt versus $30 last year, and expectations for like maybe 50 or 60. So the price of power is going up significantly in the U.S. Maybe kind of talk to us about maybe the power markets in Israel. What does that look like? How stable is that? What kind of structure do they have in them? Or just give us a sense of what that looks like.
Well, Israel does have a somewhat of a power market. I think that Israel is really trying to introduce bidding for energy, and by introducing it to the retail level, retail competition, and having they're allowed, like there are eight companies now that are bidding for the domestic sector, for the retail sector, and they had before they were only providing allowing retail competition for companies or for consumers that had smart meters, and now they're providing electricity competition for consumers without smart meters. They will just use an average of consumption to bill them. But that's a huge change to allow retail competition. Even that 50 states in the US have retail competition. It hasn't always been successful, but at least on paper we have at least 50. Half of the US states have retail competition. So for them to introduce this in Israel was a big step, given that the Israeli Electric Corporation was the primary supplier of electricity to everybody in Israel. So this was a big step to liberalize the electricity market. Though we don't know if it'll happen on the gas side, because gas still is, there are obviously Chevron is in there. There are Dalek there are different companies that are in the gas market, and they would obviously like to have more competition in gas as well.
Maybe to stay on the topic, introducing competition, as we think about it, that tends to be a good thing. In the States, as you mentioned, deregulation hasn't always resulted in more advantaged consumer pricing. There's ends up being unintended consequences of the various markets. I guess, are there markets you think that the Israeli approach was either modeled after, or are there lessons learned, do you think, from some successes or lack thereof that are being applied that give the Israeli privatization or increased competition a better chances of being successful for consumers?
I think they were modeled mostly on the Europeans because Israel, leans more towards Europe than it does to the US, even though, as I mentioned in my article, it was the US that helped stimulate the capitalist system in Israel. But so they are looking more to European markets and how they work, because there are all kinds of PXs in Europe, and they are providing a lot of electricity competition for consumers. And I think that's what Israel's thinking of doing, is having a PX, because now they're in Europe. I think the PXs are now allowing companies to have cross-border trading, having the cross-border trading, which is helping to reduce costs for the consumers in Europe. And I think, unfortunately, that obviously is not going to happen with Israel, because it cannot trust its neighbors when it comes to cross-border trading. As I mentioned in my article, Israel is an energy island in some respects, because years ago, an American company, which was hired by the Israeli energy ministry to provide it with some advice on how to move forward with liberalization, had suggested creating power markets between Israel and Egypt and Jordan. And I think the Israeli ministry was aghast, because they realized that they didn't have the kind of security there, that they needed security, so they couldn't rely on production of electricity in other countries. They had to be self-reliant. They had to keep their energy market. So that makes it difficult in some respects, because it's a very small market for a PX. And in Europe, all the PXs are joining hands now and doing more, I think, becoming more integrated. And integration is obviously a key element of what the Europeans are after. But it's not possible for Israel to be integrated with the Jordanian market or with the Egyptian market. So there's big difference there, unlike what they're doing in Europe. So they're looking to Europe in some respects for introducing privatization. But I think for the energy market, that is a different story.
What do you make, Julia, that you referenced this in your article? These reforms have been going on for a while, but the country is continuing to implement them in the face of all the stress and the war that's going on with Hamas. What does that tell you about Israel's commitment to free markets or to reform, or what do you make of the country's confidence in these reforms because as you referenced in the Western world, and Jeff referenced it up front, we've gotten a little volatile. Something goes wrong, and we expect the government to get involved. What's going on in Israel that helps them stay the course?
I think it's a long history of having to be self-reliant in many respects, but the war has affected a lot of businesses, because so many of their employees have been called up because they're reservists and they've been called up into the army. So I know that the two biggest power plants, which were supposed to be converting from coal to gas, they had to put some of those plans on hold because they didn't have the people to actually make the changes and to go in there and change the systems that they had to convert them to natural gas. But I think it's because it's been facing these kind of attacks over the whole course of its history, which is kind of sad thing to say, but I think it's caused the island mentality in many ways, and that is in the self-reliance, and that's what distinguishes people. Any people who go to Israel, they're always very surprised at how self-reliant the different sectors of the Israeli economy are. They don't necessarily want to be dependent on other countries. They can't afford to be.
It's interesting. I'm just thinking out loud here, but Julia, we get to see a lot of countries and states and see what kind of energy policies they have, what kind of power policies what they have, what their priorities are. And so, not to be simplistic, but there are some jurisdictions around the world, they put climate absolutely number one. They focus everything on decarbonization. Then they get some other results, which may not be that good, but they focus in that way. And then there are other places, and I'm not necessarily saying Israel is one, but there are other places, although it could obviously be one, which is security is number one. Like, we have to have power. We cannot rely on other people. And we've seen some of those energy systems. How would you characterize it? It honestly seems like the countries that are putting security first and then solving from there have some of the best energy systems around the world. But what would you say? You've observed all these energy systems in so many countries and seen these countries try to get better, try to get capital, try to have economic development. Like, what is the right balance? If you were in charge of a country, how would you build an energy system? This has got to be the hardest question we've ever asked any guest.
Well, what you said initially is a very important thing. It depends on their security perspective, where they see themselves having the ability to be as reliant on their neighbors, which would be nice to think that neighborhoods would be able to rely on each other. But it depends on what their history is and how they have evolved. And unfortunately, Israel has tried to be neighborly and have relations with Egypt and Jordan, but they're rather frosty at the best of times. And so it's not always possible. But I agree with you. I think other countries maybe don't have that perspective, and they are able to, and I think that's what the European Union is trying to do, is have all these countries interconnect, to increase the interconnection so that they don't have to each build their own power plant, but can rely on the power plant of their neighbors when they need excess power. There are some countries in Europe, even today, are not that keen. I mean, I would point to Hungary as an example of a country that wants to be more self-reliant and doesn't want to have to comply with all of the European Union's rules. And even if they're not related to energy, they're related to population control. But those affect the way in which countries approach their energy systems, because France is dependent mostly on nuclear power and wants to keep its nuclear fleet going. But at the same time, they also want to introduce, because it's a part of the European Union's push for renewable energy. So a lot of those countries are pushing for renewable energy, but at the same time, Great Britain now is looking to more nuclear power because they, I think, want to have more independence and not be reliant too much on Netherlands and other different countries. So it depends on. Sometimes it also changes over depending on the administration that comes in. So right now you have a Labour administration, and they're probably going to want to be more reliant on their neighbors.
It's very interesting. I was just thinking as we were talking about that, if California thought Nevada might cut it off, maybe they would make better policy. I don't. We'll have to unpack this later, but there's something about being worried that you might go short might lead you. It will definitely lead you to build in more resiliency, and I guess that's what so many power systems are missing today. Is my point.
Yes, hopefully, you're absolutely right. And unfortunately, so many companies are leaving California, so that makes it difficult for them to plan for their future, given that they're, Chevron just left, and that's going to make it difficult also for them to plan for their future. But clearly, in California, you can see the result of the anti-energy policies of the current government, what the result has been on production and the investment in new energy. So that policies can make a huge difference, especially at the retail level.
So this is an unfair question. You've been helping with law all around the world with countries who want better energy systems. Do you notice anything we should be doing in the U.S. or anything states should be doing, or from all your time helping other countries, as you now look at the U.S. Anything we should be thinking about? We're in the midst of an election. Things usually change after an election. What should we as a country be thinking about changing in our power world?
Well, there's divergent opinions between the two parties here in the U.S., between the Republicans and former President Trump saying drill, baby, drill. And then you've got the opposite policies among the Democrats, which are that you want to shut down fracking, you want to shut down energies, the carbon footprint of energy companies. I think, California has the highest, or the third highest electricity costs of any state. I mean, the highest obviously is Hawaii because it's an island, but that has an effect eventually. So their energy policy really should be viewed through prisms of what can encourage investment, what can encourage the economy. And I'm not saying that fracking is the answer, but I think that you have to take all those policy effects into account, because I think in California, we're going the absolutely wrong way, trying to mandate that every car has to be an electric car by a certain date. Those kind of policies are counterproductive. They don't actually lead to the result that they want. In fact, all the old gas-fired cars are going to be run now until they're 25, 30 years old, because people aren't going to want to buy electric cars.
Yeah, I'm really interested, in your perspective here, that I would have said 5 or 6 years ago, price and reliability were key in Europe. Decarbonization was not the key, and now it's really flipped there, where decarbonation is the key. And I guess, one of the things I wanted to kind of get your perspective is, you might have some changes in government here in Europe over the next year or two. You have, climate goals are sort of like in law, really, to some degree, kind of to 2030. How do you think the perspective, or maybe just from a legal standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, beyond 2030, do you start to see or sense that there's going to be a relaxation of that, or people are going to start to come off some of these decarbonization goals and really start to focus more on reliability and price? And the reason I say that is because the EU, just from an industrial standpoint, is just like losing their industrial base. When are they finally getting that? Do you see that over the next 4 or 5 years, and maybe we can see some change in regulatory or legal type stuff to make it more probable that we see, all of the above included?
Well, you're right that in Europe, what's they called the RE union energy plan is definitely focused on getting certain dates, getting renewable energy up to a certain percentage within certain dates. But they had that plan put in place before the war between Ukraine and Russia, and before they decided that now it was more politically important to reduce reliance on Russian gas. And as a result, prices went through the roof, and they were worried they wouldn't have enough fuel to fuel the power plants in Europe. And that was 2 years ago when that started. But that is still every fall or every end of every summer that becomes a big concern in Europe. Now, do we have enough power to be able to not have to rely on any natural gas from Russia? And I think there is going to be a more realistic approach taken, and the dates for the decarbonization are going to be pushed back, and before they can actually make that complete transition, because they don't have the fuel they need for their power plants. I mean, look at Germany now burning brown coal in their plants. I grew up in Germany as a kid, and I remember the fuel. I mean, the fumes when the coal plants were turned on, how dirty the air was. And now it's going to go back to that, and that's extraordinary, given that Germany was so keen to showcase its renewable energy, and saying that we can do this, we can change to renewable energy, we can decarbonize, and now look at what they're doing. So that's a very hard lesson to have learned. But I think other countries in Europe have seen that, and they've seen what's happened to Germany, and I think that they are not going to be quite so keen to meet those deadlines, like in the Renew energy plan that they tried to foist on all the countries a couple of years ago. They already made amendments to the dates, so I think that was going to continue. They're going to push back the dates continually.
As you were going through, the different, your different experiences through time, it kind of struck me, just how much you've seen. And I was curious, if you look back over the last couple of decades, what example of market reform or success cases stand out the most to you in terms of just as the policy change really resulted in success can be judged in a variety of ways. Could be cost, could be attracting capital, but just from your perspective, what's the most successful market reform you've been around in your career?
Well, these reforms in these former Soviet Union countries, and it depends so much on what their natural resources are. Whether they have hydropower, which some of the countries that were part of the Soviet Union have. That they have a lot of hydropower that's available to them, and they've been able to make the transition to green energy much more successfully. So it really depends an awful lot on what the natural resources are available to each country. So you can't really say one is more successful than the other, because it depends on what their access to their what they have available to them. Obviously, I think one of the countries, Croatia, has a lot of. They had one of the hardest times introducing the laws they needed to corporatize and bring in investment into their power sector, but they've done a very good job of it now. But they also do have availability. They have hydropower. They have other resources available to them. So really, I think the countries that have had the easiest time of it are those that had the resources they needed, that they didn't have to rely on other countries, and they didn't have to use coal like Germany's having to use. So I can't point to one country that has been more successful than others, because the ones that have been more successful have had a lot of natural resources available to them. Obviously, Norway is a country that has massive water hydropower, so they are able to completely, can become completely green. But other countries aren't so lucky. So I think it just depends so much on their particular situation.
I was going to ask a question, Julia, that's similar to what Jeff asked, but just as you look around the world, any place in the world, are there countries that you're working with or are familiar with that are doing some interesting energy reforms that probably the rest of us aren't paying attention to or ought to know about? Because we love talking about all the various places around the world, in particular the developing world and what they're doing to get more power. But are there any countries that stick out with you that don't get talked about often, that are doing some interesting things?
In terms of energy reforms, as I was mentioning, the EU is pretty standard uniform. Everybody has to follow the same energy sector reforms, all the electricity and natural gas and environmental directives and the regulations. So they don't have the option of choosing a different way of approaching their energy sector. They are committed to all of these directives that are promulgated by the European Commission. So they don't have as much leeway as we do in the US, where we have 50 states that all can have different ways of approaching it. In Europe, they don't have that option. So I think Europe has had some successes in introducing renewable energy, and Germany was a leader in that for a while, but I don't think that they have had much variability in the way in which they approach their energy reforms. They have to be standardized, and that's what the European Commission demands. And the new countries that became part of Europe later, they had a bit more leeway, had more time to do that. But now they are required to be even the people the countries that are in the energy community, which is I described as kind of the wannabe group that hasn't yet been admitted into the European Union. They also have very little choice. They have to do exactly what the European Commission tells them they have to do, and that's one of the preconditions for joining the European Union. So it's pretty standardized in Europe. There isn't that ability to be, come up with some innovative way of doing things.
Well, Julie, it's been so great to connect with you, learn about Israel, learn about energy law in a lot of places, and get the benefit of your experience across many years of doing this. Maybe a last question, as you can help us out. We're always trying to think about how energy is going to play out over the next 10 years. We're thinking about supply, we're thinking about demand, we're thinking about regulatory, all the various things that come together that create an energy picture over 10 years. As you think about the next 10 years in energy, are there any observations that you might have on what all of this looks like 10 years from now? What are any big picture themes that you might have?
Well, I think what is interesting is that there are so many areas now that there's a confluence of different policies. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, the different policies of the two political parties in this country. But I think the Paris Accord had assumed that we had to decarbonize because the world was on a dangerous course to becoming too hot, and that we were going to all end up burning. And I think that there will be a correction course in that. I think that there's going to be more understanding that the benefits of fossil fuels far outweigh the detriments and the supposed dangers of using fossil fuels. My view is that we will see a complete course correction, and that we will not be, because of the fact that renewable energy actually is not renewable, because of when you look at the whole the whole path in which renewable energy is developed, and you have so many aspects of it that require mining and require all kinds of things that are not in the least bit renewable. So I think that's going to be the big course correction, that we will see renewable energy not being as, right now it's still on the front burner, but I think it's going to be moved to the back burner because of the fact that we're going to run into shortages and price increases that will be so high that there will be a rebellion by big companies, industries, and even the people, retail consumers will rebel at the idea of these cost increases, in order, especially like in California, where the fuel actually is a tiny part of the electricity tariffs that you pay. It's all the taxes that they pile on top that are supposed to provide for social engineering. I think that is going to change in the future. It may not be in the next two to 5 years, but I think in 10 years, there will be a course correction.
Well, Julia, it's been fantastic meeting you. We're great to have you as a friend, and we're going to take all our international energy law questions to you. So,
okay.
Really wonderful to meet you.
Good to meet you too. Thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks to all of you.